Welcome everybody. This session was due to be shared by Michael Potter, I think, but he apparently has got another version of COVID, slightly alarming. So my name is Peter Abels, and I've been asked to share this session. It's a pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Simon Fifer. Is that how you say your second name? Not Fifer. Fifer, founding director of CAPPRe, and Simon's going to talk about, as you can see, valuing cultural heritage. As you know from the first session, the convention is that speaker speaks for about 30 minutes, then we have 10 or 12 minutes of questions before they get their bottle of wine. Okay.
Thanks, Peter. Switch the clicker on. Check that it works now. So thanks everyone for coming. I'm going to be talking about valuing heritage, and I'll take you through some of the steps in terms of what we did in this particular project. I am one of those choice modelers that Alex was referring to, this morning in terms of the guidelines. So that's what I do. Modeling values, preferences, choices. At CAPPRe, which is Community and Patient Preference Research, that's the acronym. We do a lot of work with government, like projects like this. The other part of our name is patients. And keep in mind when I show you these particular techniques, particularly discrete choice experiments, you've ever seen them before, our other work is in health, and it's valuing what's important to patients and what they value. That then goes most of the time to government, but to committees like in health technology assessment, like the PBAC, who make decisions about what drugs get reimbursed. So exactly the same methods in terms of preferences. We do preferences in everything: energy, water, environment, well-being, infrastructure, transport, whatever it is, whatever decisions people make, we sort of can model those. But it's using very similar methods. That's the consistent part. But otherwise, it's going to be very much context specific and focusing on, in this particular case, heritage. I would like to thank some members of the team. First up, in terms of the government team that you can see there, particularly spearheaded by Damien Lucas, and obviously Lucy and Michael Harris as well, and Bronwyn. And then also some external people as well. Well, John Rose, who is a director of CAPPRe, but also a professor at the University of Sydney. He was involved in this as well, and also Liz Hegney, who's from Cross Uni. So they were also key members of the team that when we were constructing this and doing it, and you'll see some of the complexities and why we have to have a broader team to actually look at what are the nuances, what are the key things that we need to capture for this project. And then obviously my CAPPRe team as well. You can see there, Dr. Thames, Declan, Nelson, and Fran, the key members of my team to actually bring this work to you today. I'm going to take you through, don't worry, it probably will be less than 30 minutes, as Peter said, even though it looks like a lot. I'll just take you through step by step in case you haven't seen any of these particular preference studies before. And then what we can have, certainly keep in mind any questions that you want to ask, and I can go through them, but just take you through the steps and how we do one of these types of projects. So in the background, I think probably people are here because they have an interest in heritage, but it is quite broad. And you'll see when the types of areas that we focused on that heritage can mean a lot of different things. So it's historic places, objects, traditions, they play a vital role. And then now we're looking at, well, what does heritage mean to people? And how would you measure it in terms of this type of space? So it is something that we call non-market valuation. There isn't a market for this per se, but how do you actually put values on these types of things that you could then use in a CBA context? I guess cultural and economic value, and we want to look at public preferences. So it is New South Wales residents, that's our focus in terms of our group, our reference group, in terms of how they value heritage conservation, and then looking at how would we use that flowing through to preferences, and then flowing through values into willingness to pay and into CBAs. There has been a little bit of research in this space, but not much. So there's a few different areas. I'll touch on them briefly in terms of where we're going. The first Allen Consulting Group back in 2005 was a very broad piece. It didn't actually focus on specific heritage items, but rather the attributes around them. And that was one piece that sort of started it off in terms of what could we look at for Australia? What would these values look like? How much value is there in preserving and conserving heritage? Then SGS Economics in 2018 extended that work. So they did actually do a matching piece. So if you read through their report, you'll see they adapted what was done by Allen Group in 2005 and extended it into making it broader to focus on actual pieces in terms of what heritage looked like and how it would be described to people, making it more relevant and context specific in terms of the framing. And framing does matter quite a bit when you're asking people about these types of things, keeping in mind that the general community, they know a little bit about heritage, but they don't think about it like necessarily the department would in terms of all of the things that they focus on, this whole catalog that's in their remit. The general community would think about specific things, maybe things that they've seen before or they're aware of, their perceptions around what heritage means to them, but it's not exactly going to be the things that we need to get values for. And then there's another paper by Throsby et al. In 2021, which once again extends a little bit on that, but doesn't take it to the level that's required for its use in terms of what we're looking to do for it, or what the New South Wales government is looking to do for it to make it relevant and usable in this context. So this study that we're going to talk about fills a lot of gaps in terms of where the literature has gone. And as I said before, there isn't much literature in this space as a whole. So there are a lot of gaps in terms of what we're trying to fill. So this was our overall objective. There is a broader objective, which I'll talk about briefly, but today I'm going to focus on community willingness to pay for 8 major cultural heritage types in New South Wales using DCEs, Discrete Choice Experiments. That's the broader name. If you're not familiar, I'll talk you through a little bit about it and certainly have some questions for me if you want to learn more or ask more about DCEs. And obviously it's a policy. The outcomes are going to be used for policy. That's the key, I guess, the outcomes and research objectives. So DCEs, what are they? I'm sure, just give me a quick look in the room. Hands up if you know what a DCE is. We've been involved in a DCE study before. All right, I've got about 3/4, maybe a little more. That's good. But I don't spend a lot of time on this. But they are a type of technique and they've been around for decades. So it's nothing is new in DCEs. There are new methods that we're applying to DCEs, but they've been around for a long time. They're used in transport, environment, marketing, health, all the areas the departments are using these types of methods. What you do is you present scenarios to people. The context and the framing is different. So heritage in this particular case, what if I was doing the environment, or what if I was doing the Powerhouse Museum, for example? Different options. The design in the middle, we heard a little bit about experimental design earlier on in terms of RCTs. These are heavily based on experimental design. You present scenarios to people based on experimental designs. So there's lots of scenarios. Each person only sees a small number of those scenarios, for example, 10. But in the total number of scenarios based on the design, there could be something like 100. The design enables us to cover us the key attributes that we want to cover, but at the same time, it generates the scenarios to get the maximum amount of information from the people when they're completing it. So it forces you to trade off. That's what these experiments are. They're preference experiments, they're trade-off experiments. So this is what it might look like, large number of scenarios, and then you get all of these outcomes at the end, including attribute importance, what was driving people's choices. And in this particular case, the key outcome will be things like willingness to pay. So we'll talk about that in a moment. Types of heritage. I mentioned previously about some of the work that's been done in the past. They haven't gone into a lot of detail. There are some consistent attributes with some of the studies, like the SGS study, but this is going broader. And in regards to the overall remit of what we were trying to do, we were presented with a number of challenges of how do we cover all the things that the New South Wales Heritage Catalogue has in it? How are we going to present that to people in a way that they can understand, give a response back that makes sense without overburdening them with a really complicated experiment? So these are the things that we focused on and breaking them down into these categories. So you can see there's residential buildings, there is commercial, retail, and industrial spaces, community and civic items, places of worship, arts, culture, recreation, design landscapes, historic and memorial sites, and Aboriginal Indigenous culture. They all had different explanations, and people were taken through examples of what we mean by these things. And we actually had pictures and collages that were created by the department and their team there of the actual items that they have in their catalogue to show what do we mean by this. Because once again, as I said before, not everyone knows when I talk about historic or a memorial site, what do you mean by that? What you show me or what you tell me might be different to what automatically comes into my head. So I'm giving you a little bit of information about what the New South Wales government has and what they're thinking about, and they would like you to use when you evaluate these types of things. So we had to break them down into these separate areas, because to go granular in attributes, we couldn't keep it an overall a bigger top line view. We had to break it down into these 8 different groups. That was the idea behind the experiment, breaking it down into those particular heritage types and focusing on different experiments within those types. The overall catalog under which we were working with, you can see here, is around 40,000+ items. And that came from the department in terms of what they have cataloged, breaking them up and down into all of those 8 different categories. And then we were thinking, okay, how do we use this, make it meaningful? So we broke it down into archetypes. So similar items. You could break that 40,000 database into about 91 different archetypes. And you can see the numbers there that are presented there based on those archetypes and how they translate to the category. So that's the idea. I'll come back to the archetypes later on, because it's relevant when we're actually calculating willingness to pay. But just keep in mind, we can summarize or synthesize this large database into a smaller number of items. These are the 8 experiments. So if you've, as I said, once again, most of the people here have seen DCs before. DCs are comprised of, we're trying to show scenarios to people, and those scenarios are made up of how do you describe these things. Descriptions in this type of language are called attributes and levels. That's how we describe the scenarios. And in this case, you can see the attributes going down the side, the levels in the middle for the 8 different heritage types. The 7 in here were consistent in their attributes. Aboriginal or Indigenous culture had obviously a different time period. So you can see how that aligns, and that was slightly different. But otherwise, this is the time period, so the era. So time period in terms of where does the heritage item come from? What is its era attributed to? Going to be super important, right? Because we are about preserving these particular heritage items. Significance, so local significance, and we layered these attributes on. So it's local significance, local and state significance, and local, state, and national Australia-wide significance. So how significant is the heritage item that we're talking about? Access, is it public access? Is it private access? Heritage items, lots of them are different in terms of their access. The condition of the item itself, distance. So it's one way to cover off a little bit of use, non-use components, distance. The number of items, which we added in for a slightly different objective, and I'll talk about that briefly at the end. But so the number of those similar items, which are based on the 90 or so archetypes. And then in these experiments with willingness to pay, we have a payment vehicle. In this particular case, it's an annual household levy, and you can see the dollar values that we used as levels. And I'll show you an example of what people actually saw and what it means. This is the scenario, an example scenario. So once again, there was information slides we presented to people. The overall survey itself, when you do these types of stated preference surveys, normally about 20 minutes, roughly 20 to 25. The scenarios and taking people through the learning, explaining what we're doing and talking about the context and showing them information to learn before they go through these things, and the scenarios themselves take about 10 minutes, 10 to 12 roughly. So 10 to 12 minutes out of a 25-minute survey is the DCE. The rest are other things we want to capture. We're clearly going to capture socio-demographics. There's lots of other things that you can capture. In this context, we captured attitudes, perceptions around heritage, and I'll show a little bit of that in a moment. But there's a whole report on the department's website, which has basically the other 10 or 12 minutes of questions, which are really focusing on what does heritage mean to you? What do you think of when we say heritage? Lots of different questions, your visitation, the different heritage places. All of that is captured in another report. And this other part is about half of the survey is the DC. But you're showing an example. So you're talking in this particular case, the era, the significance, access, the condition, distance, the number of items. And then we have split it up into some binary. So it's a binary choice. You are willing to support, pay a certain amount per year to support the conservation and preservation of this heritage type, this item. That's described by these attributes. The other option is you don't. That's why I'm saying binary. You do or you don't. If you do, you're paying it. If you don't, you're not paying it. And it is not protected under this option, but it is protected under this option. That's the idea. Once again, non-market, not a market for this. So we are saying and proposing policies where you go, the government is considering protecting this. It's going to cost this amount to the community to support it. Would you do it? Would you not do it? There's lots of other things that we talk about in terms of the certainty of your decision, making it context specific, giving certain nudges to remind people about financial constraints. There's a whole list of things, particularly relevant, obviously, to what was presented this morning in the choice modeling guidelines. So have a look at those. There's lots of different things in terms of quality assurance that you need to do to make sure that SP aligns with best practice, but that was all done in this particular context. So I already touched on certainty calibration, budget reminders. Once again, financial constraints. You're trying to, when people say yes to paying something, you want to remind them that you are actually talking about real, kind of pay real money here. You want them to think like that. Otherwise, it's meaningless. Otherwise, they could go, yes, 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 yes. I would pay $1,000, but that doesn't mean anything because obviously they're not paying $1,000. So it has to be meaningful. So you have to get that across. That's what a stated preference experiment is. Images, icons, hover over definitions, a whole learning process, which probably took about 3 minutes to go through before you actually get to completing an example scenario. And there's a lot of it of pilot testing, qualitative research, cognitive interviews that goes into creating these types of experiments. Because once again, these are people. We talked about RCTs this morning, we talked about people. People it's not easy to understand what people are thinking. So you have to actually talk to them and find out what they're thinking, and then you can see how your experiment aligns. And is it actually measuring what you intended to do? De-efficient designs, experimental designs, I said whole literature in that, but obviously this is best practice, similar to what Rose and Bleemer have done in 2009. 2 designs, one for the first 7, another one for the Aboriginal or Indigenous, just because they had different attributes and levels. So it requires a different design. 16 scenarios of those that you saw. So fairly, although that seems like a lot, it's a fairly simple scenario in the sense that you are just saying support, not support, binary, with one thing option. Some of these DCs might have 2, some of them might have 3, 4 options or multiple options. So in this case, it's pretty simple. So 16 was manageable for the people completing it. You can see here we had a really large sample of people, 4,000 plus, recruited through online community panels. Lots of testing went into that. You can see there's 2,500 people that were piloted over multiple times in a year. We had started this project right in the midst of the pandemic. We had to pivot a little bit because things were happening, and there's a lot. I don't have to tell everyone what was happening, but it wasn't a great time to field surveys about heritage conservation protection, particularly when you're talking about willingness to pay. So we just halted it for a little bit and reconvened back into 2022. Back in 2023, made some changes along the way, lots of different changes, lots of learnings. These things are not simple, so you do have to take a little bit of time. And you can see the final data collection was in early 2024. The survey itself, lots of different stages. I mentioned 25 minutes roughly on average, and it has all of these different sections. And the DC has, which is what I'm going to focus on. I'm going to get too much into formulas. I know that's pretty boring for people, other than to say that willingness to pay is derived by this particular formula, consumer surplus total willingness to pay. If you're going to take one thing away from this formula, just keep it at this low level here. It's just one option of the world versus another option, preservation versus no preservation. You're summing up utility. That formula here is summing up utility. That's all it's saying. Utility on one side minus utility on the other, and monetize the difference in utility. That's all. That's all you really need to take away from this is there's difference equals utility. That's what we call satisfaction. To economists, you know what it is. This is slightly, means the same thing, but utility in choice modeling is very specific. And you're just trying to say, what's the value of funding this protection? What's the value to the community? If you have seen these models, you would be familiar with some of the terms, but don't worry if you haven't. Mixed logits, they just allow for preference heterogeneity, so variation in preferences, which we know we're going to get. Not everyone is going to be the same. So they allow for variation, they allow for distributions. 8 models were estimated for 8 different heritage types using that payment vehicle. And it is measuring change, no change, so support, don't support. And you can then look at, well, what are the monetary values or particular scenarios, because we can model any scenario now with those attributes and levels that you saw before. Under those 8 categories, the model can handle every combination of that because of our design. So you can do everything in what-if scenarios in our dashboards that we create. So now I'm going to talk about the results. I think everyone wants to see what were the value and then how could they be used. Before I do that, I did that other report contains this information. So if you want to know what people were saying when we talk about what does heritage mean, this is a word cloud audit of what the 4,000 people said. There's lots of other information in that report, so I highly recommend if you're in the heritage space, if you haven't read that report, go read it because it has a lot of information there that would be very beneficial. But you can see it's history, old things, tradition, ancestry, buildings, exactly what you'd expect. I think people, architecture, they automatically go to buildings, even though it's broader than buildings, but that's like what people are thinking, because that's probably what they've seen, particularly walking around places like the Rocks and Circular Quay, etc., in terms of buildings and heritage. Characteristics, we actually have all the demogs there. You can see we have a pretty good spread on gender and age here. Representation in that map there, which is all on our dashboard. Trying to get broader coverage of obviously the whole state. When we do these surveys, we quota for that. We quota for all of those characteristics like gender, age, income, location, because we want broad representation, because we are looking at things like in regional areas versus metro. It's not just about Sydney. It's bigger than Sydney. And so we do want coverage and want to look at what do people in the regions think? What are things that are relevant to them from a heritage point of view that maybe are different to what Sydney side is? I was just talking about people who live there probably think, you know, they think of Sydney as the city, but what about other things into the regions that are important? What were the main drivers? That's one of the key things you get out of a DCE, attribute importance. You've probably seen it presented slightly differently. This is just a condensed view of how I can show you something in 8 different DCEs. So I'm not going to go through the 8 DCEs in total because there's a lot of information there, but just so you can quickly see what do we get out of it. Not surprising. Era. Number 1, how old is it? When was it from? It's number 1 across most of them. Not all of them. Not all of them. You can see design landscapes. It's actually been pushed down a little bit, but there are some other things in terms of era. Then it goes the number of items. So the number of items that are being protected, which I talk about later and why we added that in. Then distance, access, condition, and significance. And that forms a largely consistent pattern in terms of number 1 being the most important, number 6 being the least important. And that's roughly where we sit. And so haven't given you the actual values. We will have them in our report and obviously our full paper that we're going to publish. But this is just to give you a ranking hierarchy in terms of where they sit in relation to each other. What you do get, and as I said, this is an example of what you're probably used to seeing in terms of how people present these, particularly in publications. This slide is based on this information. Effectively, you use the parameter estimates. These are direct utility parameter estimates. You can see how they move and shape, not necessarily linear. The length of the bars give you the magnitude of importance. It's the highest utility minus the lowest utility. That's the magnitude of importance. That's how I know how much it's driving people's decisions in a DCE. So you can see how these map to these, and ultimately that's when you change things in a scenario analysis. These are the biggest things that are going to have the biggest impact on willingness to pay. It's the things that are driving change. So that's just how you use attribute importance, how you interpret it moving through. These are some examples. So we worked with the department to get some examples. They have lots of examples. And as I said, we are currently under review with this publication, which is the preference study publication. We have another publication, which is valuing their whole catalog, which I can touch on briefly at the end, but that's a much bigger piece of research. This is talking about valuing one thing or a number of similar things within an archetype. The other piece that we're publishing is valuing the whole 40,000 items in the catalog. It's a different thing. So, but just if you're going to use it from a scenario analysis, I haven't shown you a dashboard, but we have a dashboard built for the department. They can change anything to these configurable levels and it spits out a value. So that's the value to the New South Wales community of protecting that particular scenario under those conditions. You can see here we've gone up in residential buildings between 18 and 130, depending on the configuration. Under community and civic items, I've gone from 12 to 114, depending on how we do it. The overall spectrum is about 9 to about 200, depending on the different DCs, so the different one of the 8 DCEs, but then also how do I configure it? So is it older? Going to have a larger value, isn't it? What else? Is it closer to you with distance? That's going to have an impact. So all of those things matter. So when I configure those things to give the top level values, I'm getting more like these numbers as opposed to these numbers in terms of its overall willingness to pay to the New South Wales community. So how can we then use that in CBAs? We can take that obviously. So depending on what you're doing in a context, if you're looking at protection of a building, if you're looking at protection of a landmark, a park, statue, whatever it may be, a combination of those things, we can then take that and put that into the benefit side of a CBA in terms of what's the community benefits in terms of actually conserving and protecting these under these scenarios. So that's what we're doing here within these scenarios. The department and with our team at CAPPRe, we're also preparing guidelines on how you can actually use this. So when they do release or when they do publish, we will have information about how it can be used to make sure that people use it correctly and not incorrectly in terms of how they apply it in appraisals. This is an example of the dashboard, by the way. So this just shows you I can do anything with any of these inputs. I get willingness to pay. I actually get a distribution of willingness to pay, not one value. But you can see the spread, and we can show the mean, the median, whatever it is. And I have the ability to do that for every one of the 8 different heritage types. And as I said, this is just for valuing individual or like types, archetypes. The overall catalog is a different thing that we do have values on as well. So that's pretty much all I really wanted to say is obviously other than that you can read on here, but it is obviously filling the gaps. It's the largest study done in New South Wales or pretty much Australia for that matter in terms of doing types of SP or DC work on valuing heritage. We looked at, you saw the key attributes there in terms of what was driving. So the older, whether they're publicly accessible, good condition of historical significance, layering on local to Australia-wide or national significance. And we can use them in CBAs, and that's what we're obviously looking to do. It's not out there yet. So if you come and ask me to give you the total values, I can't do that yet because it's under review with the department. They will release them soon. And obviously, as I said, we also have an academic paper, which will be submitted shortly, which will go through the usual channels. And if you're in academia, you know how long that normally takes. So probably sometime early to mid next year, I would like to see that coming out. And the second paper, which I said is valuing catalog, that'll take a little bit longer. So that's pretty much all I wanted to cover, but I open the floor to any questions that you may have.
Thank you for that. Let me cover a lot. Questions? Can you say name and where you're from? We'll start here.
Hello, my name's Alistair. I'm from Essential Energy. In the town I'm in, we have a lot of old buildings.
Yes.
And every now and then I walk down the street, someone asks for donation for an old church or whatever.
Yeah.
So on the day, I'm revealing how much I'm prepared to actually pay.
Yeah.
Yeah. From what I see here, and it's all scientific, you're asking people, how much would you pay? So people are saying how much you pay versus on the day, this is how much am I revealing I'm going to actually pay for a multitude of things. There's an assumption when you ask someone that that is what they'll do on the day. Has there been any, with all these outcomes, for some of them, presumably, for some of those charities that they do maintain a heritage,
Yes.
might be some possible cross checks. Well, this is what our numbers, when we ask people, this is what they're actually going to do in the real world.
Yeah.
Has there been any cross checks with any of these to say, yeah, or just does it sort of feel right or look in the ballpark with what the real world actually is versus when we just ask?
Yes. So that's on.
It's an old argument.
Yeah, no, it's great. Good question. I mean, this is related to all stated preferences in general, not just the heritage one. So it's a good argument. So external validity, how does it translate to real world behavior? My whole PhD was in this particular area. My PhD is in hypothetical bias. So when you say you're going to do something, what do you actually do in real life? So I have a really good context. I was doing it in transport for that matter, but it doesn't matter. The same thing else. So a really well-designed stated preference experiment can align very closely with real-world behavior. To your context, I think it's slightly different in that when you ask me to reveal my behavior at that point when I'm giving a charity donation, the whole payment vehicle is very different. You're asking me, what do I have on me at the time? On the day, do I want to tap my card? Do I want to pay? It's very different. So we're doing this is an actual levy, like an annual levy that's coming through. In this particular case, it was coming through council rates, if you have council rates, and it was passed on to renters, etc. So you have to actually have a realistic payment vehicle. So it is slightly different in that context in terms of you're asking me on the day to hit me up to give change or tap a card, as opposed to this being an annual payment. So I think, yeah, exactly, it is. So I think they're sort of different context and framing. That would explain a little bit of the difference, but I can certainly give you more advice on external validity of the methods. But a well-designed study can get very close to real behavior, but there is a lot of research on external validity on this type of work. But in the heritage space itself, other than that context that you just mentioned, the actual having the real, there's other ways of measuring value. So that aren't probably those types of willingness to pay studies. So they probably default to other economic methods that are more revealed preference, similar to payment, but then they're not going to be exactly the same context and framing that you mentioned. But yes, there are other methods that you can use. So,
Okay, gosh, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 sets of hands up. Go to the next one back here, please. Yes.
My name's Matt Seymour from Ace Island. Just quickly, I'd like to know, when you described what protection means to the participants, does that mean that, you know, if they vote no, the building will fall down tomorrow, or does it mean there'll be a protection and it might not have actually been, you know, destroyed?
We don't provide a huge amount of context in terms of, obviously, because it's over time and it's very context specific in terms of a statue, an Indigenous item versus a building. So you go into that level of detail, you're probably going to run into a little bit of strife about too specific. But we do say it's this, basically the government is not going to conserve or protect, so they're not providing additional resources to do that. Whether it lasts through time is not something that we were going into. It's just that they're not pumping money into maintaining it and preserving it. So that's the context. So the sort of the no, or the default option would be, yeah, probably some maintenance will be required and other things that could happen to it in the interim, but it's just not going to be a constant spend. Yeah, we need to maintain it, but we cannot say that it would necessarily fall over or it would be decrepit or whatever that may be. That's very context specific. It's just that it's not being prioritized by the government to maintain and conserve and preserve it. But we aren't giving the alternate version of that. Yeah.
Hands up. We should be getting more each time. I go to the back and then here, and we'll have to see because you both had your hands up earlier. Yes, please go ahead.
Thanks. Again, students,
Speak up.
so good to hear the work we did for Heritage for Knowledge Bay. I guess my questions kind of relates to maybe the first question we'll ask, and it's more around the quality research and the testing you do. What is the experiment design before you did a full study? Because I saw you did a couple of pilots. Are you able to just shed a bit more light, around that process?
Yeah.
What things you learned from that? I guess the question got asked before around like the price attribute, like what sort of what are the key sort of indicators come out of that testing process to give you confidence people actually believe the framing of that price that what they're being asked to pay is actually what they're willing to pay in the best scenario?
Yeah, a good question. So yeah, as I said, couple of years of piloting interims with the pandemic happening in between. We do spend a lot of time, and part of it is to Yuan's point about the payment vehicle. We did spend a lot of time on the payment vehicle. So the payment vehicle itself in the framing is pretty consistent with previous studies. So we've often used an annual household levy. You do describe it. You have to be consistent in how you describe it in terms of how would people actually pay. As I said, council rates, etc. With renters, non-renters, we have a bit of a mechanism to do that. The level, though, we did change, by the way. So the levels that you threw out those pilots, you can see the max level I had previously was around about $350. We actually had a much larger band when we started, and we reduced that because you can test the thresholds about how people are responding to the much higher levels. And you can see, well, maybe we've hit a threshold at say $400 because above that, there's not many people choosing it. So we can articulate. So the pilots definitely cover up with the levels. They do go to the payment vehicle framing. If you go to the session later today with Kusha from Treasury talking about value of statistical life, which we are also working on with Treasury, we've done a lot of work on framing, and that is particularly important, and we have changed the payment vehicle. So you'll learn a little bit more about payment vehicles and framing if you come to that session later on. In regards to other things that we changed throughout those 2 years, The presentation of the information. So how does it look? The look, the icons, the words, the framing, dual scenarios versus single scenarios. So having two scenarios compared to one. Multiple things we changed and tested, ended up with that being the best and most simplistic version that generated respondent behavior that was consistent in what we were trying to measure. But there were iteration upon iteration throughout that process where we would test and test and test. But those are the types of things that would go into lots of those types of surveys. And you then look at, well, are we presenting the information in the right way? And payment vehicles is one of many things we changed along the way.
Here, the front.
Jason from New South Wales Treasury. Thanks, Simon, for your work. I noticed with the access attribute that there was a fee aspect to that. Is that collinear with the payment vehicle, or?
That would have been, so no, it wasn't. It wasn't, that's just like a one-off fee to say, for example, if you visit a house that's private and you have to pay to get in, we were just obviously aligning it as that's sometimes the case, or you have to pay to visit something. That would be relevant if someone was obviously, if they thought that was either them visiting or they would like it to be free for everyone. And that's certainly an opinion that some people had, but it wasn't obviously linked into our payment vehicle. But it's just I guess a preference that people were saying that in most cases, they didn't like to have a payment associated with access to heritage because they believe it should be accessible to everyone, given that the government is helping preserve and conserve it.
One more. No, can't take 5 questions. The other 5.
Thanks. First of all, Simon, really enjoyed that presentation and love to see the development of sort of off-the-shelf values that can be used in CBA easily, because I think that's really important. I had a bit of reflection when I saw some of the way those things were bundled together in sort of like civil infrastructure. Should introduce myself, Alex Swanberg from Transport for New South Wales. And I was reflecting that obviously train stations are really cool, but like other civil infrastructure like schools are really boring. But kind of interested in like, when you bundle things in that way, are you able to draw out more individual elements in the study that you did, or at the other end of the spectrum, could it maybe hide some of the differences between individual parts of the things that you're trying to measure?
Yeah, no, great question. And that was basically the whole preference experiment is trade-offs. That's a trade-off to us as the research team, exactly what you just said. We traded off how top line do we want to go versus how granular do we want to go. And in those particular cases, working with the department, we're able to then work out, well, they deem it as these categories, right? They said, oh, this is how we think about it, and broke them down in that way. And we did have words to say, and there were more words than that, by the way, when you did a particular type of experiment. We said, it's these types of things that you might see. The images were, there was more images and there was larger images to show them what we're talking about in that context. But that was also picked with the department as well. They were saying, well, these are the types of things we'd like people to think about. So it may not cover everything, but it's probably better than nothing. And by the way, we did test images versus no images. That was one of our, I guess, a little bit of a RCT, if you want to call it that way, but saying, oh, does it matter? Does it matter when you have images versus not? So there's lots of those things in context and framing matter, and that will impact people's preferences. But that's our limitation we have to deal with in terms of how granular we go to.
One more question. Hello on the left, hand up. Yeah.
Thanks. Dom Behrens from the CIA. You mentioned here sort of this isn't, you can't just add all these things up to then get a total value of the stock. Did some quick phone calculator maths, and I think if you have the bottom end of the estimate for the 42,000 items, that's like $400,000 a household per year or something.
Yeah.
It makes no sense. What insights would you take from these results about starting to think about how you would go to getting that total value? At some point, you probably get some diminishing returns. At some point, there's people who don't care about other things. How would you go about getting to like that sort of total value?
No, really good question as well. And I did do a seminar for Aries earlier on in the last year which covered this, and I can share some information. But we did this. It was our second objective with this study. I'm not talking to talk about it. They sort of raised it and on the fly saying, we want you to do this, and now we want you to do the whole catalog. So in this particular context, what we did was we took a max willingness to pay. So we had them do the DCE. We had them give their values about where they were saying yes to different values. We then had additional follow-up questions, which looked at a max willingness to pay, which had to be equal to or greater than what they said they would pay in the actual scenarios themselves. And then what we did was we took the 8 DCEs, got individual conditional parameter estimates, got willingness to pays, got prioritized values across all of the 91 archetypes, and we then redistributed the max willingness to pay of an individual. We took that and we were able to redistribute a cost across all of the 91 archetypes. And then we were able to sum it all up because it was on a max willingness to pay. So not assuming everyone will pay 100,000. It's only based on New South Wales community residents max, distributing the 91 archetypes. Then you can sum up, and they're more reasonable values. That will be in our second preference paper that we're publishing. But yes, it's a great question.
Well, Simon, thank you very much for your presentation. Clearly could have gone on for a bit longer because of the audience, but we have to move on to the next one. So